Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, the amazing Helen Castor in her book, The Eagle and the Hart. I actually almost missed this book. Interviewed Dan Jones, asked him what's the best stuff out there. He's like, Helen Castor's book. I immediately went out and got it, and it is as great as Dan says it was. Immediately reached out, was able to get with Helen, and I'm so grateful because she's a great interview. Really excited about the story. Had a wonderful conversation. I'm going to try and have her back like 10 times because now I have to catch up on her back catalog. It is that good. So how about I shut up about it? Let's talk to Helen. And here we are with author Helen Castor, The Eagle and the Hart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV. Helen, it's an honor to have you on here. Thank you so much.
It's an honor and a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Now, I do want to mention we had Dan Jones on who, and I can play it back if we need to, says everything that he knows is because of you. So I say this for two reasons. Number one, I just want to be able to say that I interviewed Dan Jones just to get some credit. But also, you're amazingly successful. You're all over the place. You're author, broadcaster, just like Dan is. What does it feel like when, first of all, you're so successful in your own right, but then somebody else who is also of that stratosphere is like, oh, I know everything from her. Do you just wake up every day and say, I'm a huge deal?
First thing I have to say is that it's absolutely not true because I learn from Dan every time we have a conversation. And it's one of the joys of my professional life that I get to talk about the history I love with someone who's such a good friend and with whom I've been talking about this stuff for, he worked out, did he tell you this bit? It's 25 years since he first walked into my room in Cambridge to start studying medieval history. And basically, we've barely shut up since then. It's an absolute joy.
And listen, it was great talking to him, and it was very funny. I'll just say, before we started recording, you had said, oh, you really liked my review. And I'm like, thank God, because there's a dick joke in there. And I'm still trying to kind of work through, like you just said, at Cambridge. I'm talking to somebody from Cambridge, and I'm just making totally puerile jokes. And I really appreciate you humoring me.
Oh, my God. No, I mean, if you don't think there haven't been dick jokes being made at this end for the last 5 years while I've been writing the book, Dan will be able to back me up on that one. All sorts happens behind the scenes. And it's such a pleasure to talk to someone who's read the book with such attention and humor. Those are the two things I'm always looking for. So thank you.
Well, and also I give myself a hard time, but then I remember Shakespeare loved juvenile jokes. Now, I'm an American, which means I've only pretended to read Shakespeare, but my understanding is he's the actual required reading over in England. I mean, especially for these two characters that we're about to talk about, has his influence on this waned at all since he wrote this, or is it still as strong as we think it is?
I think it's huge. I've lost count of the number of people who've said to me since I've been out in the world with the book, or even talking about it before it came out, who said, oh, my favourite play. Usually I would say it's Richard II, which I have to say is my favourite. I've been going around lately saying, I think Richard II has a claim to be Shakespeare's greatest play, and it's only in the last couple of weeks that I've realised that what I'm actually saying is it's the one I love the most, but I'm kind of going fight me with it. But some people absolutely adore the Henry IV plays as well, and it's not that I don't love them, it's just that Richard II is the special one for me. So I think it's really hard in a way to get past that Shakespearean veil, if you like. But on the other hand, that's such a richness to bring to thinking about this period. I tried to put the plays out of my mind while I was researching and writing, but actually that means it's been such a joy to come back to them with everything else that I've been reading, all the contemporary sources for the last 5 years, and now to come back and reread the plays, and it feels like I'm seeing so many more layers now. I mean, Shakespeare is just a genius, so there's never a bad time to read him.
Now, you wrote the dual biography, right, which is Richard II and Henry IV. I was actually going to say, why do the dual biography? But especially after reading it, I guess the question is, could you actually do a biography of one without the other? They are so intertwined in so many ways. Was it just a no-brainer that you would need to talk about both of them?
It felt, by the time I actually sat down to start figuring out how I was going to do this, it did feel like a no-brainer. But that's such a good question, because in all the years leading up to, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I wanted to read it, if that makes sense. I know that's the kind of thing authors say, but because there hasn't been a study of the two of them together. And you begin to wonder whether that does have something to do with Shakespeare, because Richard looms so large as a character. He's so larger than life, so theatrical, so melodramatic. And then in the Henry IV plays, the figure of Henry Bolingbroke in the Richard II play, he's the nemesis. He's the one who brings the king down. And then in the Henry IV plays, he's this kind of grey man dealing with rebellion after rebellion and then problems with his son, and it's all about fathers and sons and so on. So I think it's Henry who's never had the attention he deserves. And once you see that they are first cousins, they were born just 3 months apart, and actually Henry's the younger, although he always seems to be older in the portrayals that you see, and that their lives were lived in such parallel, one deposing the other, but they were such different men that Richard has the right to rule and none of the qualities that you would look for in a leader. And Henry has all the qualities but doesn't have the right. As soon as you start thinking about it in terms of that parallel, it just seemed irresistible. I discovered later on, as I got into the book, why Shakespeare had done it the way he'd done it, because the last bit of the book was actually the most difficult to get right, I think, for me in the writing, because once Richard's been deposed and he's off the scene, how to keep the drama going when that theatrical figure isn't centre stage anymore, and not to allow the end of the book to be a kind of dying fall. I hope I've managed it, but that was a real challenge.
Richard II, especially after reading this, because I think you lay it out step by step so well, and he just kind of sucks. I don't know a better way or a fancy way to say it, but you read it and I couldn't help but thinking, is he just one of the worst English kings? Because he is everything that people would hate in a king. It's like, treat me like a king and do exactly what I say, but I am not going to do anything kingly. And I just started, because then you think of King John is, I think for at least Americans, he's the apex of he's terrible at it. But John tried. He failed at everything, but he tried. There was effort there, even if he was a lot of negative things. It's almost like Richard II is apathy incarnate. Is he hard to write? Honestly, I could feel you almost straining to be like, reader, I know he's terrible, but I have to explain why. Or is that just me?
No, that was you. I was trying so hard to show, not tell. I didn't want to be beating my reader around the head saying, this king is appalling, because, the risk is that you're then sort of provoking a contrarian reaction in your reader. But don't stop telling me what, I wanted to show what he was like as fully as possible and leave room for readers to come to their own conclusions. And a friend did say to me the other day, he said, I finished the book liking Richard more than I expected to and liking Henry less. And I was very confused, but I was very delighted, because I wanted there to be that space within the text for the human reaction, because I was trying to put together as rounded portraits as I could of three-dimensional human beings. But you're absolutely right about Richard, because you're right. John tries. He tries to get a grip of his administration. He tries to go to war. Whereas Richard, as you say, he likes the pomp and the circumstance. He likes the magnificence and the clothes, and he likes everyone prostrating themselves before him and calling him the most highfalutin titles he can possibly think of. He's the man who starts English monarchs being called Your Majesty. Before then, a simple my Lord King would do, but for Richard it has to be Your Royal Highness, Your Majesty. He likes all that bit, but anything to do with bestirring himself, and certainly bestirring himself in terms of responsibility to his subjects. He sees all the rights, and he doesn't seem to see that those rights come with responsibilities, with the Spider-Man thing, isn't it? With great power comes with great responsibility, and he just doesn't see that half of the equation. So working out why he turns out like that, when he's the grandson and successor of one of the greatest kings medieval England ever had, who understood exactly what the responsibilities of the job were. Working out how Richard got it all so wrong was my starting conundrum, if you like. And that's what I'm trying to show in the early chapters of the book, is to how did he turn out so badly?
What I find so fascinating every time I read about him is, I think, probably the greatest question in English monarchy. What happens if the Black Prince doesn't die? He's endlessly fascinating to me. He is the archetype of what, especially around this time, people say, English king is supposed to be that guy. And he dies, and this leads to Richard II. And I think it's fair, what your friend said, that they kind of liked Richard more. I wouldn't say I liked Richard more. I definitely understood him more with the way you presented him, because he doesn't just show up and act like this. Can you talk a little bit about how the Black Prince basically dying prematurely, how that kind of thrust him in a situation where he may not have ever learned what a king should actually look like?
That's exactly it. Richard is born in 1367. And by the time he's 3, his father is already ill with a chronic illness that's going to kill him in 1376. But there are years before that, those years from as early on as Richard can remember, when his father is essentially an invalid and clearly not in a good condition physically. He's in pain. This is not an easy household to be in from that point of view, but it is a household wrapped in cotton wool. And meanwhile, his grandfather, Edward III, is in his 60s and also not well. So he hears a lot about kingship and what kingship should be, but he can't see any of it. So he's not learning from experience as the Black Prince had done. Edward III had been only 17 when the Black Prince was born. So the Black Prince was thrown in the deep end as soon as he was old enough to ride, or he was old enough to turn up at court for great ceremonies, or, he was fighting at Cressy at the age of 16. So this was a real apprenticeship that the Black Prince had. But not only does Richard not have that, what I would add in is that the closer I looked at Edward III and his Queen Philippa as parents and how they treated their enormous brood of children, the more I thought, actually, they are being extremely emotionally indulgent of their children in terms of the expectations of the medieval monarchy. And that emotional indulgence plays itself out in several ways. The Black Prince's oldest sister, Isabella, is allowed, after being jilted at the altar as a teenager in quite a sort of embarrassing public way, she's allowed to choose not to marry until she's 33, at which point she picks a very handsome French count who's a hostage at the English court and says, "Daddy, I think I'll have him." And Edward III frees him, gives him the earldom of Bedford, and lets her get married to him. So there is a sort of sense in which these children are being allowed to make their own decisions much more than your average royal family. And that applies to the Black Prince too. I struggle to think of another English heir to the throne in this period who could have got to 31 without being married, and then to be allowed to choose to marry his first cousin once removed, very beautiful woman, Joan of Kent, known to the family as far as we can tell as Jeanette, who has already been married twice before in quite scandalous circumstances. So this is a sort of very indulged family. Obviously, the Black Prince is a great warrior, but I think in emotional terms, both the Black Prince and Joan of Kent, who's been allowed to get rid of her first husband in order to, in the sense, no, I don't mean bump him off, but to have that marriage annulled in order to marry someone she too has taken a fancy to, Sir Thomas Holland, and she has children with him, and he's died, and then she marries the Black Prince. This does not happen for heirs to the throne. So I think for Richard, there's a double whammy, triple whammy, if you like, that the household he's brought up in is a kind of cocoon because it's a household built around an invalid, his father. It's also a cocoon because it's very emotionally indulged. No one is saying, right, pull yourself together, get on with the job. And then because the Black Prince has been allowed to wait so long to marry, Richard is a very young child while all of this is happening. If the Black Prince had married 17 or 20 even, same kind of age as his father, Richard would already have been in his 20s by this point. As it is, he's 9 when his father dies and 10 when his grandfather dies. So he becomes King of England at the age of 10, having been brought up in this very magnificent, very lavish cocoon where he hasn't really been pushed to do anything he doesn't want to. And he's going to be pushed even less now because he's the king. Who's going to tell the king to get off his backside and do his homework? And not only has he been not pushed, he's been pretty much told that he's unique because he's his father's only legitimate child. And at a parliament held after his father's death, before his grandfather's death, he's been brought into parliament to reassure the political community that the future is safe. And the Chancellor has made a speech introducing him in so many words as England's Messiah. He has been sent to the parliament. The king has sent him just as God sent his beloved son to all his people. Now, everyone sitting in that room knows that that's political rhetoric, apart from the 10-year-old boy who's being described as the second coming of Christ. And I think those are the kind of ingredients, along with Richard's coronation, again, when he was just 10, anointed as God's elect on earth to rule over the English people. Those are the kind of ingredients that build into a young man who can only see his own specialness and the rights that he should have, and he feels are not being given to him because, of course, his government is being run by grown-ups. And instead of seeing that grown-ups have to run his government because he was 10 when he became king, he sees them as the enemy, not France, against whom England has been fighting a war for decades and is still fighting a war in which Richard shows no interest whatsoever.
And then you've got the complete other side of the coin, which is Henry IV, where his father, John of Gaunt, is basically king for Richard for an extended period of time. And I, especially the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, it's almost, those two sides of the coin where it's John of Gaunt has to do all of the work. Henry sees his father ruling, doing all of it, but also, and you really hit this pretty hard, John of Gaunt is, in a lot of ways, has some wonderful qualities, does some wonderful things, but also he was kind of hated, which is something I really didn't realize up until now, that there was such a strong feeling against him. Why were people so against John of Gaunt even before he started to do wild things like trying to be kings of other countries?
Gaunt in the 1370s, when his older brother, whom he revered, and his father, whom he revered even more, were both ill, somebody has to step into the breach to try to keep government going. While everything is really beginning to fall apart, the war's not going well. That means you have to ask for more taxes. Asking for more taxes for a war that's not going well doesn't go down well because people don't want to keep pouring good money after bad for campaigns that don't achieve anything. It's the best of all possible worlds for a medieval government is to be winning a foreign war. But the worst of all possible worlds is to be losing a foreign war. So poor old Gaunt gets that end of the stick. And he becomes a lightning rod for blame because he's not the king. He's trying to step into the breach, and he isn't a proud man, and he can come across as arrogant. He doesn't like people attacking his father's throne. He responds badly, he slaps people down, but he is intensely loyal, and he's trying his best to hold everything together, first for his father and then for his nephew Richard. He is the grown-up in the room who is having to deal with complaints in Parliament, deal with diplomacy in relation to the Scots and the French, deal with attempting to lead campaigns onto the continent to try to shore up England's deteriorating military position there. There are times when you look at Gaunt and you think, this man never stops moving. He is exercising power, yes, but somebody has to, and he's doing it because he sees it as his duty. Yes, he's ambitious, but always hand in hand with his duty. And he was hated because people on the outside, people in Parliament, people in London in particular, saw the arrogance, saw the pride, and they believed that he was trying to take power for himself, for his own ends. And there were these fears about a wicked uncle and a boy nephew on the throne. Of course, in the 15th century, the story of the wicked uncle and the princes in the tower would come to another iteration. But already by this point, you mentioned King John earlier. Of course, when King John becomes king, he's the brother of Richard the Lionheart, the previous king. But there is a question about whether their nephew, Arthur of Brittany, little Arthur, should have the throne instead. John takes the throne. Arthur disappears into the bowels of one of John's castles and never comes out again. So the precedents for a boy nephew and a potentially wicked uncle called John don't look too encouraging. That's not what Gaunt is doing, but people from outside have their suspicions, and it gradually becomes clear that Richard too, who was always interested in history when it could serve his own purposes, had his own suspicions of Gaunt, and that was not going to be a relationship that was going to go well as the years went on. But Henry, as you say, Gaunt's son Henry, growing up at Gaunt's knee, sees his father doing his duty, sees how hard his father's having to work, and sees how poorly he's rewarded with all the blame and hate that comes his way. So Henry's learning very different lessons from the ones that Richard is learning.
I feel like Gaunt is very underappreciated in British history. I mean, when you talk about absolute loyalty under the worst circumstances, I think William Marshall's the only other one where you can say their loyalty just knew no bounds somehow. But also from, the perfect complement to your book is, of course, Dan's book. Gaunt's loyalty, it's funny, Henry IV, of course, is an usurper, but the fact that Henry's children are so loyal to each other, ultimately, it feels like it all starts with Gaunt, that he really put forth this example with one huge, huge exception, that they created this loyalty and this willingness to do the things that they didn't necessarily like.
I think that's exactly right. And you look at that branch of the family, the Lancastrian family, and let's count Blanche of Lancaster in here too, Henry's mother. She died when he was very young, but she seems to have been an exceptional woman. And certainly the two daughters that she left alongside Henry's older sisters, were both formidable characters in their own right. The oldest of them, Philippa, who ends up marrying the King of Portugal, and she becomes the mother of the golden generation of the Portuguese monarchy. And so I think this is an extremely able family. And I think you're entirely right that the culture within the family that you can see being passed down the generations is one of using your ability to the best extent you can in the service of your family, your dynasty, and your country, not necessarily in that order. And Henry doesn't have whole brothers, but he has his half-brothers, the Beauforts, who also are extraordinarily able men, also play a very significant role in his reign as king and in the reign of his son, Henry V. So these are generations of really interesting, really powerful, really ambitious, but really loyal and dutiful men and women. I think they're a fascinating contrast to Richard's side of the family, where you have these two very indulged parents, the Black Prince and Joan of Kent, producing just one son who shows no interest in having children of his own. And the best understanding of that I could come to, given that we can't see behind the closed doors of their public lives because we don't have letters and diaries of the kind that modern historians are used to. The thing I love about medieval history is that I'm trying to see the picture in a jigsaw when I've only got half the pieces. But the best understanding that I could come to with Richard is really that, maybe we'll talk about his sexuality or possible interpretations of his sexuality later, but definitely there seems a sense that Richard's view of the world is that he is the radiant centre of the world around which everything else should revolve. And the idea of having a child who would then be explicitly the next heir to your throne, representing the future without you, is not an idea that sits well with Richard. It's not psychologically a place he wants to go to. And politically, he then constructs a regime that uses all the resources that would normally be given to the heir to the throne. So I think there's something very different going on in that branch of the family from the Lancastrian dynasty. And as you say, Gaunt is the wellspring of that.
And just jump into Richard's sexuality since it's kind of come up. It's very simple. If people look back in time and you say they're not interested in having children, the first thing that you're going to come up with is they were probably gay, which, you can never quite know. But for me, it just seems very much like, especially the way you put this out in the book, it goes back to what you were saying. He just didn't want somebody that was going to look to take his throne. He was too selfish to have children, is my guess. I know we can't prove it, but was that kind of your feeling overall?
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it, how we judge these things, because Edward II, of course, is Richard and Henry's great-grandfather, is a king who's usually assumed to have been gay or at least bisexual in our senses because of his devoted relationship with Piers Gaveston. And I think that's probably right. but he had children with his wife, Isabella of France. So being gay or being sexually interested in men is not incompatible with doing your duty as a king and producing an heir to the throne. And then the other thing I think we have to be careful of the other way round is the kings that get into trouble because they have male favourites who seem to be in the limelight too much. We assume that they're gay. But any king that doesn't get into trouble for having favourites, we never even ask the question. And I think there are some other kings that we could ask the question about who were very good at being king, but the question doesn't come up because they don't have a favourite on whom the spotlight is shining. So in terms of Richard, I think his relationship with Robert de Vere, who was a companion of his childhood, 5 years older than him, Richard seems to, the one man in Richard's entire life whose interests he does seem to have been prepared to put ahead of his own, or at least on a par with his own. That seems to me to be a relationship on Richard's side of such intensity and devotion that I think we definitely need to countenance the possibility that Richard was gay. But that seems very likely to me that we would call his sexuality gay, but I also suspect that he didn't like being touched very much. That's the conclusion I ended up coming to, that he's so fastidious in his habits and so preoccupied with his regality and his magnificence. He likes people to kneel before him. He likes people to gaze upon him in awe, but he's not a physical person. And we know that his first wife, Queen Anne of Bohemia, was very concerned. There are little hints in the surviving sources that she was concerned that she hadn't produced an heir. And various historians have argued, and of course this is a perfectly plausible argument to make, that therefore obviously it was not a chaste marriage. They were having sex. It was just she wasn't getting pregnant. But there is another possible reading, which is she's desperately doing everything she can possibly think of. But if it's not happening because Richard won't do it, then it's not happening. What's the poor woman to do? So I think we can't know. As you say, we can't know. But my sense of Richard is that he's so unphysical and he's so preoccupied with surfaces and with image that I wonder if he liked anybody touching him at all.
Now, I think the perfect microcosm of Richard, and I did not know about this. I read this in your book and I'm like, this is just perfectly explains this guy. He decides, after really not taking interest in anything, that I'm going to fix Ireland. Now, as a descendant of Irish Catholics, of course, I'm going to personally be very invested in this story. But it's just, he just thinks, oh, I'm just going to go fix it. I'm going to show up, and because I'm king, standing in Ireland, all of the Irish are going to look at me and be like, oh yeah, everything's fine now. And of course, he gets there and everybody's seemingly very nice to him, which everybody knows if an Irishman is making fun of you, then they actually like you, but neither here nor there. It's kind of perfect for him, right? Like that he thinks this extremely complex, this entire society that has, I'm just going to say it, very valid reasons to hate England, he's just going to show up and everything's going to be fine because he's him. It's perfect, right?
It is perfect. It's perfect on so many fronts. One, it's not France. France is where his father and his grandfather have won glorious victories on bloody battlefields that he wants nothing to do with. What he wants to do in France, it turns out later, is he wants to make a glorious peace and then have a wonderful summit meeting with gorgeous clothes and lots of presents, and maybe we'll come to that in a minute. You're so right. Ireland for him has the great virtue of not being France. It is in theory already ruled by England. You're quite right. The Gaelic Irish have many reasons to hate England, and things have been a mess for a very long time. And the last king who set foot there was King John. You know, he keeps cropping up in this conversation, doesn't he? But it's exactly that Richard thinks he can go with an army, which he is not going to fight. We already know doesn't fight. But the army can do a bit of overawing in military terms, and then he can sit on his throne, and the overawed Gaelic Irish can bow before him, prostrate themselves before him, call him Your Majesty, swear oaths to be his vassals, and then everything will be sorted out. And as you are indicating, I take that point entirely, that it's a good sign if they are making fun of you. The Irish, I think, saw Richard coming, and they knew exactly what they needed to do in order to get exactly what they wanted out of him, which was to participate in this theatre of submission, swear oaths that meant a lot in the chivalric culture of England and France, didn't mean anything in Gaelic Irish political culture. So you can swear them with your fingers crossed behind your back. Don't even need to do that. Tell the king what he wants to hear. And then not only will he go away again, but he has taken you under his protection, just like the English lords that you are fighting against in Ireland, trying to get lands from or to keep lands away from. So not only has Richard not understood the significance of what he's doing, he's actually, in important ways, made things worse, because from an English point of view, you want the English lords who hold lands in Ireland to be able to impose order and keep the peace in Ireland. Well, if you've just said, well, you're my vassal, but so is the Gaelic Irish chief that you're fighting against, it's even harder to find a solution if the king is not there rolling up his sleeves saying, I'm going to knock heads together, tell me what the problems are, I'm going to sort this out. That's the kind of work that Richard has no interest in at all. So, yes, he thinks he's made a terribly significant step in subduing the wild Irish, as the English often call them. And instead, they have absolutely seen him coming, and he's solved nothing.
Now, with Henry, I tried to come up with what situation perfectly encapsulates him, but I think it's much harder. You know, you have things like the Merciless Parliament. You have so many different times where he's a quasi-crusader. I don't know if we can fully call him a crusader. It depends on how you define it. His jousting, his martial skills, that there's so many different options that you can kind of pull from. Is there one that you can think of where you say, like, when you want to see the real Henry, all that he can do, this is who he is?
Actually, the thing that comes to my mind, because as you say, his public career is so varied because, of course, he's doing the work. He's doing what initially a great nobleman is supposed to do, and then he ends up taking the throne and is trying very hard to do what a king is supposed to do. And that encapsulates so many different forms of work, forms of responsibility, forms of the exercise of power. But the thing that strikes me so hard about Henry, of all the people I've ever studied, and Dan has sometimes accused me of getting a bit too close to my subject here, but people like Henry. And even though we don't have diaries and memoirs and letters and so on, it's palpable in the sources that you read that he makes friends and he keeps friends. And the one person who doesn't like Henry is Richard. That may tell its own story. But so the story that I'm reaching for to tell you something about Henry the man is that when he's on these European travels, as you say, he goes crusading in Prussia and Lithuania against the pagans of Lithuania with the Teutonic Knights. He then goes as a pilgrim to Jerusalem. He passes through many of the great courts of continental Europe, including the Duchy of Milan. And he meets a young noblewoman there, she's in her teens at this point, called Lucia Visconti. And Lucia Visconti says a few years later, when she's being asked to agree to marry someone else, a German princeling, she says, and this is in the state papers of the Duchy of Milan, she says if she could have been sure of marrying Henry, she would have waited to the very end of her life, even if she knew she was going to die 3 days after the wedding. That's how much of an impression Henry had made on her. Now, you might think that's a teenage girl being blown away by a glamorous golden boy breezing through the court, and it probably was that. But when Henry became king, Lucia got out of this marriage that she was supposed to make to the German princeling. She got that annulled in the end. Henry was already married to someone else. So that marriage that she dreamed of couldn't happen. But she was left a bit adrift. She was one of many, many sisters. Nothing was being fixed for her. And Henry remembered her. And Henry knew that there was a very dashing young nobleman at the English court, Edmund, Earl of Kent, who didn't have much money because there were 3 widowed dowager countesses in his family who had most of his estates. But Edmund was a jouster, he was a fighter, he was a glamorous young knight, and Lucia potentially had a pretty big dowry coming from Milan. And Henry sent a personal messenger over to Milan to make arrangements with her cousin the Duke for this marriage, and brought Lucia to England and gave her away at her wedding in what was clearly the Hello magazine glamour wedding of the season. It's in every single chronicle that you can read in England that the Earl of Kent married the Duke of Milan's cousin and how beautiful she was. And this was, I mean, when I was going through the edit with my editor, who's also a brilliant historian, he said, look, Helen, you've got to explain the political context of this. You've got to explain what was going on between England and Milan that made this a diplomatic marriage. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked and I said, I'm so sorry. It isn't. This is a personal gesture on Henry's part to rescue a young woman that he remembers from his travels, who he knows had hoped to marry him. And he's fixing her up with the best marriage he can. It doesn't quite work because Edmund, Earl of Kent, then gets killed in a military campaign in an island off the coast of Brittany very soon after the wedding. But Henry always remembers Lucia and looks out for her and tries to make sure she's okay. And that, to me, gives something of the measure of the man, that there's something intensely human about Henry, even in this age when it's hard to see the human being. And that's one of the reasons I think people loved him. It may also have been one of the reasons that he wasn't quite, unlike his son who became Henry V, quite hard enough as a character to construct the persona of kingship that allows a really, really successful king to have the whip hand in his kingdom. Maybe that was one of the problems. He had a lot of other problems at the same time, but I have a real soft spot for Henry, and I think it's because other people around him liked him and loved him.
Well, I mean, Helen, it's a great story you just told, but for me, the fact that he had Frenchmen who liked him, I think trumps everything else. I mean, listen, it doesn't happen in history, but you kind of led to this too. We're jumping over the usurpation real quick, but we'll come back to it. Richard sucks. We've already established that. But then Henry still has to put down revolt after this, after that. I think anybody who looks at this really doesn't, until they read the book, then they'll understand. But if Richard was so unpopular, why are people trying to bring him back once Henry gets him off the throne?
That is a very good question that leads us straight back to the usurpation, the events of 1399. By 1399, Richard is the biggest threat to his own kingdom. All sorts of things have happened in the reign up till then. But the last 2 years, 1397 to 1399, Richard has unleashed the full force of what he thinks his kingship should be on his kingdom, which is reeling under the onslaught, because what Richard thinks his kingship should be is the ability to destroy even the greatest noblemen who he feels have been standing in his way. In 1397, he destroys 3 of the greatest noblemen in the kingdom who had stood up to him 10 years earlier, actions for which they had explicitly been pardoned. But suddenly, in 1397, those pardons aren't worth the parchment they're written on. And they are all destroyed. One is imprisoned for life because he begs and weeps and pleads for his life in Parliament, and Richard rather likes that. So he's imprisoned for life. The Earl of Arundel, that's the Earl of Warwick. The Earl of Arundel is executed, beheaded on Tower Hill. That never happens. We're not with the Tudors yet. I mean, kings, medieval English kings, do not, as a rule, execute their own noblemen. And most shocking of all, the Duke of Gloucester, John of Gaunt's youngest brother, Richard's uncle, Henry's uncle, is arrested, imprisoned at Calais, and then the next thing anyone hears of him, he's dead. What's happened? Well, it turns out rumours are flying at this point, but he's been murdered on the king's orders within his prison at Calais. So this is extraordinary. And then for the next 2 years, Richard embarks on rule that is essentially tyranny. In other words, I can impose anything I like on you, my people, but I don't have to obey the law myself. That's not kingship. That is a direct attack on everything a king is supposed to do, which is supposed to be protecting his people, upholding the rule of law, and providing justice. And the final, what turns out to be the final example of that, is that Henry, who's already in exile at this point because the other 2 noblemen who'd been involved 10 years earlier in standing up to Richard were Henry as a young man and another nobleman called Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Norfolk. They, in their terror about what might happen to them, turn on each other and accuse each other of treason. Richard says they have to fight a duel to decide who's telling the truth. Richard then says, stop everything, stop the duel. Actually, I'm exiling you both. But you can inherit, when in exile, you can inherit any lands that are due to you while you're away. John of Gaunt dies broken-hearted only months later, and Richard says, oh, sorry, Henry, no, you can't have those lands. I'm going to take them into my own hand. At that point, Henry and the whole of England have nothing really left to lose. The greatest threat to the safety of Henry's family, his future, his dynasty, and the whole realm of England is to let Richard stay in place. Because if even the greatest nobleman in the country can't depend on being allowed to inherit his own inheritance, his own estates, when he's been convicted of no crime, where's the security for anyone else? So Henry comes back without an army. He's just got his household, faithful, devoted household men around him, comes back in one ship. Richard has decided, so little does Richard understand what he's done, that he's gone off to Ireland again because he quite fancies some more of that kneeling and scraping that the Irish lords have been doing. So Henry comes back and England rallies to him. This is where he gets called the Eagle of my title. The Eagle Duke, they call him, come to save England in various poems that use the badges, the heraldic badges. Richard's men are the white harts. That's the badge Richard uses. And Henry is the Eagle Duke, come to save England. So England rallies to Henry in this moment when, above all else, they have to get rid of Richard. And if Richard is going to be deposed, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. He's an anointed king. Henry is the only possible candidate to succeed him. He has a claim to the throne. He's Richard's first cousin. He's the son of the great John of Gaunt. There are other people around with claims to the throne, but the main candidate is a young boy at this stage, and another young boy is not going to help anything. So England rallies to Henry, and a way is found to depose Richard. It's a abdication, deposition. He's not king anymore. Okay, let's, all agree he's not king anymore. So the threat is gone. And as you rightly say, if Richard's been so terrible, why then does the man who replaces him have such difficulty? Well, the difficulty is you've got rid of a tyrant, and in his place, by necessity, is a usurper. And that means that anyone from now on who begins to feel they have a problem with Henry has an immediate go-to, because he has a claim to the throne, but he doesn't have the claim. And he's hoping that God will vindicate his claim to the throne by allowing him to rule well, and therefore showing that he is the rightful king and God is smiling on him. But every time the threat of rebellion raises its head, or the threat of external attack, and that's pretty often just from the very early months of the reign, because you have France are not happy that the English have got rid of the king they just made a peace treaty with and married the French king's daughter to. The Scots will seize any opportunity to make trouble, particularly in concert with the French. And Wales, for the first time in years, Owen Glendower raises the flag of rebellion in Wales in 1400, declares himself Prince of an independent Wales. He too sees the opportunity. And that's before we start on rebellions within England. So poor Henry, here's my sympathy coming out again, but this golden boy who's acted to take the crown for himself, not because he's a Machiavellian figure who's always been plotting to get his hands on power, but because there really is no option left, finds himself a usurper, finds himself 3 months later facing the very first rebellion of lords who've been closest to Richard. He barely even has to put it down. The people are so angry at Richard that they lynch these lords and hack their heads off in mobs before Henry can get to them. But once that rebellion has taken place, this is an iron law of medieval English politics. Once the first rebellion after a deposition has taken place, it's too dangerous to have a living ex-king hanging around the place. And Richard mysteriously dies in his prison in Pontefract, probably, we think, starved to death. So Henry knows he's got his cousin's blood on his hands. And from that point on, anyone who wants to cause Henry trouble only has to say, you're not the rightful king. Good King Richard should be king, which they can say safely now because everyone really knows he's dead. And that then he can be the kind of stalking horse. His banner can be raised in the attempt to put somebody else on the throne, somebody convenient to the person raising the banner. So it's really a rolling ball of trouble that just gets worse and worse for the first few years of the reign. And just when it starts to turn a corner, when things start to go Henry's way, his health collapses. So he's not at full strength, and he's got to contend with the fear that God is punishing him for what he's done. It's not an easy hand of cards he gets dealt.
Now, listen, we know you and I are both on Henry's side. It's okay. We can just admit that.
We're among friends here.
Exactly. But you said it too. He had no choice. It was die penniless, exiled, or go get his stuff back. It's very sad because I think from the beginning of this book, especially with who Richard was, this was the only way it was going to end, right? Like if it wasn't Henry, it would have been probably somebody else, because Richard refused to A, do the work, or B, learn any lesson whatsoever, right?
Exactly. If he learned any lessons, it was exactly the wrong ones. He, instead of seeing why, again, we're jumping about chronologically, but for very good reasons, why in the late 1380s, why there had been trouble in his parliaments, why various nobles had stood up to him. It was because the war with France was going so badly that England was about to be invaded by the biggest French fleet since the Norman conquest. And at that point, when trouble arises in Parliament, because Parliament's being asked for more money in taxation, this is 1386, more money in taxation than has ever been asked from a single Parliament before, because there's a big fleet over there that's about to descend on England, on the coast of England. Richard, when asked by his Parliament to dismiss his Chancellor and get a grip of this situation, says, "I would not dismiss a scullion from my kitchen at your request. And if you keep coming at me with these unconscionable demands, I will ask my cousin, the King of France, for help against you." Can you imagine anything more delusional when a French fleet is about to arrive than saying, "My cousin, the King of France, will understand because he's another king. He'll be on my side." I mean, it's madness. And then when government is taken out of his hands because Richard has said that, he makes everything worse by refusing to cooperate and then getting his judges to redefine the law of treason to say that anyone who either forces or even persuades the king to do something against his will should be punished as a traitor. Now that means that any advisor to the king at any moment could find himself branded a traitor, because all the king has to do is turn around and say, "Well, you persuaded me to do that. I didn't want to." This is the horrendous crisis of the 1380s that ends up in the merciless Parliament of 1388, with the five lords standing up to Richard, led by Gloucester, Arundel and Warwick, but with Henry and Mowbray joining in to try to push back against this redefinition of the whole relationship between the king and his subjects. They have to do some pretty dodgy things to enforce that pushback, because, of course, trying to push back against the king is a pretty dodgy thing to try to do. But instead of learning those lessons, Richard does take a step back. He realizes he's got to be a bit more circumspect, and he takes a few years to sort of re-establish his position at the head of government while Henry goes off gallivanting around Europe, partly because it's fun, but partly because putting a tactful distance between himself and his cousin seems like a good idea at that point. But you'd think, wouldn't you, if you were optimistic, that this was Richard's chance to rethink how he'd acted in the 1380s, to learn from his uncle Gaunt, who's back from his own European adventures, having gone away in 1386 as the most hated man in the country, and then everything falls to horribly disastrous pieces while he's away. And so he comes back in 1389 and everyone says, "Gaunt, thank God you're back." The one man who's not implicated in this horrifying disaster that politics has become. Richard has the chance to learn from him. And does he? No, he's, it turns out, planning his way towards a coup that he launches in 1397 to get his hands on the power that he thinks should always have been his. So not with hindsight, I can see why people were hoping that he was learning lessons, and that because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. But with hindsight, the hindsight that you and I are looking back with, which I've been trying not to use in the book. I'm trying always to stand in the shoes of the people who were living through it, to try and understand what the choices looked like to them, and to make sure that this reads as I hope, a narrative with cliffhangers in it, because the people living through it didn't know what was going to happen. But for you and me, looking back with hindsight, yeah, Richard was never going to die a happy death, breathing his last with his happy family and his happy subjects gathered around him praising his name. Not going to happen.
Helen, if I can send you back in time and let you speak for an hour with any one person in the book, I'm taking Richard and Henry off the table. It's too easy. Who would be your number one person that you said, "I would love an hour with them to talk about this"?
Ooh, now that is a really interesting question.
Now, I will say you just brought up my number one, which would be Mowbray, because I feel like he's a tragic figure that gets caught in between, and just when everything starts to go wrong, he just ends up wrong place, wrong time constantly.
And panicking. And panicking is never a good reaction, and it feels as though he doesn't have good people around him. Henry's got good people around him. He's got Gaunt. Before Gaunt's death, he's also got the very experienced Lancastrians around him. I'm not sure who Mowbray had, but he's panicking, and panic is making everything worse. you're absolutely right. His perspective would be invaluable. Do you know what? I was just about to light, in political terms, on someone very close to Mowbray, and that is William Bagot. Now, William Bagot is one of this triumvirate of men in the 1390s who climbed the greasy pole very rapidly in Richard's service. They're called Bushy, Bagot and Green, and they turn up in Shakespeare as well. They get called the caterpillars of the Commonwealth, these men who are on the make. But what's so fascinating about Bagot, as opposed to Mowbray, who you rightly say seems to be in the wrong place at the wrong time every time, Bagot manages somehow to be in enough of the right place to survive. So Bushy and Green lose their lives. Bagot doesn't. Bagot has served during the 1390s. Earlier on, he's made himself extremely useful to Mowbray, Henry, and Richard, and Gaunt, pretty much all at the same time until Richard becomes the star to follow. But he survives Richard's fall even, and he's the one who, when he's brought into Parliament in 1399, he's the one who confirms that, yes, Gloucester had been murdered at Calais. He knows where all the bodies are buried, and yet he survives. I would really love to get his perspective on what's going on. And he seems like the kind of slippery character that can only have been sticking knives in people's backs, but actually he sends a message to Henry when the Lancastrian inheritance is taken by Richard. He sends a message to Henry in exile in Paris and says, the king has sworn himself your enemy. If you're going to get this back, you're going to have to do it yourself by force. So Bagot sees everything and somehow manages to survive. So I would love an hour with Bagot. My other candidate, because I'm so conscious of all the women in this story, they're not at the centre of the story. This is a very male story at the centre. But there are so many interesting women in this story. And one of the most forceful characters among the women is Henry's second sister, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is another one of those women who seems to have had an eye for the handsome man, who again manages to get her way in a very extraordinary way. She's betrothed as a very young woman to an even younger Earl, the Earl of Pembroke, then falls for Richard's half-brother, John Holland, who's a bad boy, a very, very bad boy, gets pregnant by him and then gets her dad to sort everything out so she can marry him. And then when he dies rebelling against her brother because he was too closely associated with Richard, a couple of years later she spots another very handsome man jousting at a court tournament and ends up marrying him, clearly having had a word with her brother. So on a purely human level, I would love to meet Elizabeth of Lancaster. Can I have two?
You can have two. I'll let it happen.
Thank you.
Now, this is a hard question for authors, but I find it really fascinating. You're a world-renowned historian. So if you're not researching, who are your favorite history authors to read? Obviously, we're going to say Dan Jones, because if you forget him, he'll be crushed. Who else is on your list of, they have a book coming out, I have to read it?
Non-fiction, because obviously there are historical novels that I am obsessed with.
You can bring those up too.
Okay. Well, I love people who write prose that I can just sink into. So even if they're not strictly in my period, and one of the people I'm about to mention is sort of, given that my period does go into the Tudors, she goes on further than I do. But Jessie Childs is an absolutely brilliant historian, writes about the 16th and 17th centuries. And the way she writes, the insight, the understanding, but also her sentences are extraordinary. And then going even further than that, I've just been reading a new book by a historian called Tim Blanning, who used to be a colleague of mine, a very senior colleague of mine back when I was teaching in Cambridge, an utterly formidable historian, as well as a very, very generous colleague to me when I was a very junior young whippersnapper. And I will read anything Tim Blanning writes, because the combination of a historical mind like a steel trap with the ability to write really pithy prose. And his new book, which I wish I had sitting next to me so I could get the subtitle right, it's called Augustus the Strong, something like a story of artistic creation and political fiasco. And it's about a ruler of Poland in the very early 18th century. And not my period, not a place I know about, but what a joy to read.
Anything with fiasco in the title, I think
exactly.
I'm writing
you can't
that down.
resist. Yeah. Augustus the Strong. You don't have to go further than that, do you?
All right, Helen, last question for you. Just something I always have to ask, right? A lot of people think history is a high school class that was super boring. They passed it. They don't need to do it anymore. They stay away from books like this because they think it's boring. If I sat one of those misguided people in front of you and they said, Helen, I don't like history. History is boring. Why should I read The Eagle and the Hart? What would you say?
First of all, I would say you don't have to. If it's not your thing, that's fine. I completely understand. People like different things. But for me, history has always been telling stories about what it means to be human, what it has meant to be human in the past. And that humanity is at the heart of the stories I want to tell. So I'm interested in how power works because it shapes the world we live in. And I'm interested in psychology, in people, in what makes different people tick and what makes them react differently in different situations. So that's how I try and write my kind of history is I put my characters almost, they're not my characters, they're people who lived, but as best I can see them, put them in the world they lived in and try and show how their lives panned out. It's storytelling. And I hope that means it's accessible to anyone else who's human, who's willing to give it a go.
Well, Helen, it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute joy and a privilege. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Helen, thank you so much. The Eagle and the Hart, one of the best books of 2024. Hands down, go out, get it. It's awesome. Hit us up, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Don't forget YouTube. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.